probably are snoozing outside, which is a bit of a loss, but we will get them by and by. This session, as you know, would be looking at some of the challenges of building possibilities, alternatives, issues of how to have better movements, etc. Mirko will tell you more about that, but let me simply tell you who we have as the panelists. Of course, you know all of them, simply for the sake of formality. Mirko Herberg, he would be chairing the session. He is the Project Director, Global Trade Unions Program of FES, Division for International Development Cooperation and Department for Global Policy and Development. Martina Sproll, she is a professor at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. Mike Fichter is a professor and administrative director of the Center for Labor Relations at the Free University of Berlin. Clair Ruppert is working with the Central Unica, Claire, how does one? Dos Trabalhadores, Brazil. Sorry for my pronunciation. And of course, we have she's almost a host here, Professor Jayati Ghosh. She is a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University. With that, Mirko, over to you.
Thank you, Praveen. I would also like to welcome you to this somewhat concluding session of our GLU conference. I would say that we have heard a lot over the past two and a half days about the reincarnation of neoliberalism and the many ugly faces of it and its descendants. We have heard stories ranging across the globe, but often giving us similar accounts of how workers these days are being treated, how they struggle to make ends meet. We have heard a lot about the cybertariat. We have heard about delivery boys that are called junior managers in India. We have heard about attacks on labor market institutions, and well, some even said that these are attacks on our societies and on our social fabric. So there was a lot of bitter analysis out there, and we would, being from Germany and being dialectical in thinking, would like to turn things around and now look at how we can maybe look at the death of neoliberalism, looking at perspectives, because I think our central proposition is that we do have agency, and the trade union movement and labor movement has a strategic choice, no matter how much in the defensive we may be. And we have all the opportunities to swing the pendulum back towards societies that we imagine of. And we have heard it several times talk about power resources of trade union movement, and I hope that in our final discussion we remind ourselves, yes, that we do have those, that we are in the process of seeking them out, finding them, unearthing them, and applying them for our struggles. With having said that, I am going to start asking Mike Fichter, who has, over the last years, looked intensively at realities of global supply chains and its implication for labors, and also how trade unions react to those realities. And I'm asking Michael to share with us some of what he has heard here during the conference, but also from his previous work on sort of how workers can take agency and defend interests in global supply chains, how they can face the transnational corporations. Mike.
Okay, thank you. I've got two mics. How many more mics do I have? Here, my name's Mike, and here's these two other mics, and there's all mics all around here. So just looking at all these expectant faces out there. Actually, we're up here to sort of just kick off a discussion. We want to have a broad discussion. You know, all of you have participated actively in the last 2 days of this great conference. And so it'd be a shame if this session turns into just a small minority group here giving talks and you just sitting there listening. So take this as really as impulses. Also, a lot of the impulses are just very personal. Personal insights, personal impressions of the whole 2 days. I'm supposed to talk about especially about the stream on global supply chains. I admit I didn't hear all of the papers. I actually went to some of the other streams as well. But I think definitely anyone who looks at the program and listens to a variety of the papers would agree with me that the question of global supply chains, the papers really brought out the fact that this is a very complex phenomenon. That the structures, the politics, the dynamics of global supply chains need more research, and they need lots of concrete empirical work done on them. We heard presentations, very diverse presentations on price pressure on workers, a number of presentations on the garment value chains. There was one on the tea value chain, on precarious workers, on global framework agreements in their impact on the global value chains, on the automobile value chains. So there's quite a diverse selection of insights into the value chains. And I think what it also shows us is that in studying these different phenomena, we really have to be more creative and to think out of the box. This is what the challenge is of global supply chains too. It's changing the way unionists can operate, the way unionists can be representative of their members. It's changing the way of the way unions cooperate or relate to each other. And I think that these papers also show that unions really can and do mobilize power resources. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on. From my point of view, and this is what I've said in my presentation again, is that I think that we're facing a really new phenomenon here. That these global supply chains are the factories of the 21st century. They represent really fragmented processes of production, where normal production process has been fragmented geographically and internally in terms of the kind of work relationships and the work structures that exist. The workforce today has become much more global. It's marked by categories of diversity, divisions. Workers compete very, very strongly worldwide among each other. There's categories of gender, ethnicity, migrants, there's permanent workers, there's temp workers, there's on-demand workers, there's home-based workers, and so on. Well, this is not new, of course, but I think it's taking on a new dimension, a much more threatening dimension for trade unions as they now exist. I was in a session yesterday where we talked a bit about trade union organization and organization levels, and our good colleague Kjell, brother Kjell, brought up the issue that trade unions have more or less in their organizational development for a long time followed the progress of capital, the way capital formed and became more and more concentrated from the local to the regional and to the national level. And I think also that you can add to that that trade unions also followed the development of the national state, of government, and the political structures from the local to the regional and then to the national state. But trade union organization has basically stopped at that point. And trade unions are still bound by the nation state. And the question is then for me today, in light of the global supply chains, in the light of the power and the massive expansion of transnational corporations, do trade unions have to rethink their organizational status today? Do they have to rethink the way they cooperate with unions in other sectors and in other countries? I'm not saying, of course, that the state is no longer an actor. Of course not. It's become a very negative actor for the working people. It's the promoter. It's been more and more the promoter of actually of promoting global supply chains, of deregulation, and providing massive subsidies and support for transnational corporations and their investors. So when we look at the spread of transnational corporations and global supply chains, what we don't see is right now is a model, trade union model for a transnational union organizational level. I'm not going to say a trade union organization because I don't think that that's realistic at this point. I think though there are basic steps that can be taken in order to overcome a very inward-looking national focus that many unions have. And I'm not saying that unions should not be concerned with the local and with the national. Of course they should. That's where their members are. That's where the problems are. Problems at the workplace. That's the basis upon which unions build their strength. But that has to be linked to the global, because that global is impacting more and more on those decisions and on the situations, on those relationships at the local level. And I say this in spite of I know that the global union federations have, over the last several decades, really changed their outlook, changed their possibilities, moved forward in many ways, and that's a really good sign. But up till now, it's still not enough, and I think that there's much more that has to be done. And not just at that level of the GUFs, but also at the level of local, sectoral, and national unions. I say this too because I think it's become very clear when we look at organizational statistics of unions around the world that there are a vast number of so-called union-free zones. And these are not just within the sector or within the area in which unions are already active. They have problems right there at their own front door. But there's around the world these kinds of union-free zones that corporations are using to undercut the standards that do exist in other places. And that's what unions, I think, have to realize and begin to work together to overcome them. What is this going to take? I think we have to look and see that unions are going to have to attack these problems with more organizational flexibility. Learning from the past is a key element of moving forward. There's many ways of learning what they did at the local and national level to be able to focus on the transnational level as well. Unions also need, secondly, to build a new consensus for these problems within their own organizations. I know within different unions there are certainly lots of people who understand these problems of transnational activities and the globalization and the problems that it's presenting for working people. but there's also many people within unions, brothers and sisters, that are still very concentrated on just what's at their own workplace and are not ready to look beyond that workplace to the to the problems that are being put on them by decisions made in completely different parts of the world. Unions can take this topic of transnational organization and transnational policies and frame it in a way that integrates it into their daily operations. And they can reach out to other unions and in other sectoral unions and across national borders to build trust and knowledge, to foster cooperation, of long-term cooperation. I think this is really a long-term task. And they have to be very transparent in doing this. They have to recognize their own self-interest in cooperating with unions that may have different self-interests. But that's something that's on the table. It has to be on the table and has to be agreed upon and compromises found. Finally, there has to be a commitment to integrate the local with the global and spread this commitment throughout the whole unions. Unions, as Mirko said, are actors. Unions have agency. I believe very deeply in that, and I think that there's ways of changing the situation, turning the situation around that we face today. They can use and mobilize their power resources to exercise more influence, raise labor standards, and protect workers' rights. And I think what the conference here has really shown to me is the value and the need of this kind of research, this kind of academic work, this kind of cooperation between academics and trade unionists for more strategic research. Research cannot, in our eyes, cannot be neutral. Research has to be strategic and it has to be interest-based. And we want to do this in order to improve the lives of working people around the world. Secondly, I think that in addition to this rich body of research and that has been presented here, that we can complement this with other projects out there doing very similar work. And I'm referring in particular to the project we've been working on at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation on trade unions in transformation. This is for those that haven't heard about it yet, this is a project we've collected 26 different case studies of unions that have been able to change their organizational structures to develop new policies and have moved forward and have found successes in opening new paths to representing workers' interests. You know, we have many different cases. For example, in Nigeria, the textile workers, faced with the problem of low-cost imports undercutting their products, what did they do? They were losing jobs in the factories, they were losing union members. Okay, instead of just trying to hold on to those jobs, they reached out to the self-employed tailors, to the home-based tailors. Now they have different interests than the factory workers in the garment industry, but they found ways of communicating with each other and broadening their bases in order to be a strong lobby for the textile industry towards the government. Or the case of LATAM in South America, the airline workers at these different airlines that have come together, built and communicated and communication cells among themselves, been able to influence working relationships and prevent management from undercutting and even lowering wage levels. Then we have, partly in part of my own work, the example of the IG Metall in the north, working together with the union in the south, in South Africa with NUMSA, to try and discuss how they can better organize along the value chain, working together across different countries from different points of view, different nodes in the value chain, plus also working with unions in Hungary, where many German auto suppliers and manufacturers have outsourced in order to cut costs and lower wages. They work together with the unions in Hungary, and they're working together with the US Automobile Workers Union, UAW, trying to organize German companies in the automobile industry in the South. Those are just some of the examples, and I'm sure there's many more that would be of interest to all of you, but that's just a way of showing how this power resource approach can really be used. All of these cases use the power resource approach and show how unions can mobilize the power that they have to be able to achieve such results and strengthen their organizations and their representation power. And finally, the GLU itself. The GLU is a great network. We have a network here, and we're communicating with each other. This conference is a great example of how that kind of interaction, that communication, really stimulates all of us to keep up this work and to interact even more deeply. But the GLU is not just the conference, it's the alumni, it's the programs at the 5 different campuses, and this kind of network, which shows how North and South can work together, is a really good example, I think, of the way forward for unions to take advantage of the situation, take advantage of these resources, and turn it into success as agents of the working people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for reminding us that, or showing us a little bit the perspective of how unions, by building associational power across borders, can stand up and face transnational capital. And thank you also for reminding us that we here within the GLU network have a role to play in this. And I was very happy also to hear in my conversations with colleagues on how such collaborative efforts are already shaping up between global union federations like the ITF and GLU students and alumni. And I think this is the way to go, and this is the way for us to reclaim agency. Now we want to look a little bit into the question of the development of technology and the world of work. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about that, certainly in Germany, also in other countries. The ILO at its centennial in 2019 is going to put that on the agenda. What is the future world of work? And we realize that through technological innovation and development, which has always been there, but which may be accelerating in its pace and changing a lot how production and service delivery is organized these days, and it brings a lot with it, a lot of uncertainty, we feel, and we are not going to give all the clarifications and how to overcome that uncertainty, but we hope that Martina, from her own analysis, from what she has heard over the conferences and discourses she's been following, will give us a few ideas on how we can have that agency also in the future world of work.
Thank you very much, Mirko. Hello, everybody. So I was asked to reflect a little bit on the conference stream concerning the changing technology and the world of work. And in spite of what Mirko said, that this is globally one of the big debates today, I think it is a bit surprising that there has not been more focus on that topic here in the conference. In fact, it was not a full conference stream, it was just some single panels focusing on that topic and not over a very broad scope. I think this is a point we should maybe strengthen or change a little bit in future conferences, because technology is a very important factor. I think technology has always been a key factor for the form of capitalist accumulation in general, and a very important factor for the dynamics of change of the world of work. And so we are now facing a new phase, as Mirko already said. We are facing a new phase of introduction of new technologies, which are very diverse, in fact. So we have a very, very heterogeneous picture. We talk about very different phenomena. So this is one of the first tasks we have to differentiate a little bit. I think the focus, the areas which have been addressed here in the conference are those which are of major importance for us because they include a very, very strong and frightening tendency towards an increase of informalization and of precarization. So this is, of course, a topic which is where all the conference streams, of course, are very much overlapping. So, but this is, of course, also one of the topics we're facing when talking about new technologies. And, with regard to that heterogeneity, I think we did not have panels really addressing topics like big data or artificial intelligence, things like that. I think the most interest has been on the gig economy, on crowd work, platform economy, that kind of new work which is coming up, and where I think there's still a very strong need of research. We still don't know enough about it, although Yuma in one of the panels this morning said it is not so new. We have these workers already for many years working in those places, and we, I think, have to put an effort on getting more ready in order to confront this situation as a global trade union movement. If we also now focus a little bit on platform economy, crowd work economy, there's so many different expressions for that. Just to remind of some very important or central characteristics of it. Why? Because I would like to take up something Mike has already pointed to. I think we have a big problem as our trade unions still follow an organizational pattern which is not appropriate anymore for today's world. So this is, I think, one of the really major challenges. And I think that a platform economy can give very good examples for what do we have to change, in which direction do we have to go. So the first step is always to do analysis, to understand the dynamics, of course. And this is not systematic and not a summary of everything which has been said in the conference, of course, but just some of the points which I think are very important. First of all, when we talk about platform economy, we have to ask who are the workers and where are these workers? The workforce is global. It's also a global workforce, but it is very difficult to identify. We have similar problems in the global value chains. And in fact, also when we talk about a platform economy, we are talking about global value chains. We have crowd workers in the global north, but we also have them in the global south. But still, there's a difference, and there's an international division of labor which is asymmetrical, which is hierarchical, as the employers, those who run the commercial platforms, are mostly located in the global north. The workforce is located everywhere. Okay, so we also have this dynamics of global value chains here, but not in all segments of crowd work or platform economy. But one of the major problems is that the workers are mostly working from remote places. So we lost something which has been so central for organizing the labor movement. We cannot meet them in a common workspace. So this has disappeared, and this is, I think, a very important challenge, and which means that we have to think about other forms of approaching workers. Working hours are not regulated anymore, so there's also not a specific time where we can meet them. For many, it is not a full-time employment. Maybe it's not even considered to be an employment. It is an additional job which does not give enough money for a living wage, something like that. So this means there's a very different comprehension of wage labor, also linked to crowd work, for example. Yeah? They are men, they are women. There's slightly more men than women in this segment of platform economy. Most of them are highly educated. We are not talking about the low-skilled people, but, and I think this is also something we find in many value chains, in fact, although they have a high qualification, the tasks are not qualified. Huh? So this is also something which I find a very important starting point for thinking about new strategies, because this affects identity of workers. It is not occupation anymore, or the qualification. Yeah? This sort of disappeared as an anchor point for our organization strategy. And this leads me to another question, which has been discussed in one of the panels. Well, we have the problem that many of them do not have contracts. They have 0-hour contracts. They don't have contracts at all because they're freelancers, they're self-employed, and so on. So what kind of working force is that? Are they wage laborers or aren't they wage laborers? So what does that mean for trade unions? Are trade unions responsible, or is it a target group for trade unions if they are not considered to be workers? So we have very urgently to think about our definition of what is a wage laborer, what is a worker. Huh? I think that we, in any case, have to include these who do not have well, formal contracts, etc., because they are a mass in the world of work we are looking at in our daily work. Yeah? So this is a very important point, addressing something which I think points to identity, but maybe in a broader way, as it has been discussed in the first introduction panel on new technologies. Because I think it is not just, for example, the millennials. Huh? This is also, I think, one group we have to think about. Yes, because they have a new self-comprehension. Huh? But it is a big variety of different identities and self-comprehensions, and we have to find a way to deal with that. That means we have to develop very different channels of addressing different kinds of workers. Huh? I have some other points on my list which I would like to mention at least. One thing is that I think also for that kind of work where it seems so difficult because where there's anybody sitting at home at his or her computer working with an app, and but we still need to understand what is the labor process. Huh? This is also, I think, something which has not been addressed at all, to look more deeply into the form of the labor process here. And because, why is that so important? Because I think one of the really most important challenges linked to that kind of technology work is control. We have completely new forms of control, and we have to find new ways in order to meet the challenges linked to that. Okay. Then another point is so many of these workers, I already mentioned it, they do not have a full-time job. Maybe they work and are not paid in the end because they didn't make it. It was others and things like that. Yeah? So this is not a model for reproducing labor force. Yeah? So what does that mean? This means that we have to think much more about the way how we are reproducing ourselves. So the reproduction side, I think this is true for also the global value chains research and organizing. We have to include the reproduction side more thoroughly, and this means, for example, that we have to include discussions on welfare state, on social security systems. So this is really on the agenda, and I think this is underrepresented in our discussions. Welfare state, social protection schemes, and so on, already is part of the broader topic of regulation. And this has been one of the very important discussion points, in my point of view, in the conference, that we need more regulation. This is a problem for these new fields of employment, of production, like crowd work, because we do not have any regulation at all. It does not fit to national labor law, it does not fit anywhere. So there is a very urgent need of formalization, of regulation. And this leads me to a very fundamental question. Oh no, before that I would like to say that, almost at the end, there was one very interesting example of how to organize platform workers. This is an example of German trade unions. It's IG Metall and also the services union Verdi, who built a so-called fair crowd platform. So they use the technology and the means of production of the workers themselves in order to bring them together, and in order to give information on, hey, there are trade unions, and you can go to a trade union and they give information on the platform where to find a local trade union which would be interested or responsible for that kind of workers. So this is a very important thing, and I think, well, without doubt, we have to go that way, but it is not everything. So there's, I think, globally a very important debate on what is the task of trade unions. Should they focus on collective bargaining, or should they go into the political sphere? And I think this is one thing which has become very clear. They should do both. So we really also have to address the political sphere and the question of political regulation.
So thank you, Martina, for particularly reminding us of the issue of the sphere of social reproduction, something that I share with you, that it's sometimes underestimated in our discussions, and that shows also new avenues for stronger trade union involvement. Again, we have heard sort of the need for organizational flexibility of unions, and I think we're going to make ourselves really popular with the many with the unions that we will meet, because we demand organizational flexibility here and organizational flexibility there. A lot of learning that is required. So that, of course, is also a question for us on how we approach that in the communication with our trade union comrades. Now, I'm going to look to the left to Clair, and I'm still under the impression, of course, of the discussion we had on Brazil, where there's a very concerted effort, to tear down all the protection, all the regulation that have been built over the past decades by sort of a brutal sort of assault on what you have achieved. So what we have just heard from Martina on what needs to be done. I mean, you are really facing a huge backlash from the extreme right. Yet we turn to you and to Brazil with a sense of optimism, because you have been very successful in building movements, in building alliances, in sort of increasing what we call the societal power of trade unions. And I think that you have, despite the difficulties that you go through at the moment, a lot of experiences in that regard on how to build those movements, what it takes to form coalitions, something that we will benefit from, and I think that you will also work on and build upon to build your counter reaction to what is going on at the moment in Brazil. Yeah.
Thank you, Mirko. Actually, I was planning. I think it's working. Right? Yeah. I was planning to do something, and then we changed, and we said, okay, let's focus more on the discussions of the things related also to the challenges imposed of neoliberalism. But as member of the trade union family, I cannot also make no analysis, so I will try to reflect what we have been discussing, especially regarding neoliberalism, and also to identify some challenges which were already pointed, some of them by Martina and Mike, but yeah. So today, neoliberalism, the financialization of capital, and its domination of the real economy constitutes the new phase of accumulation of the capitalist system. The conditions of production today occur in global value chains already, with millions of workers and subcontractors in precarious conditions and excluded from the labor markets. In a scenario where capital is advancing by capturing democracies, as happens, and as it's happening in Brazil, in favor of its interests, the automation that has already taken place in various working places is challenging the working class. So at the present stage of capitalism, the very centrality of labor is being questioned. Due to the intense processes of technological innovations in which workers are challenged to defend their identity as a class, as already Martina also mentioned, in a scenario which individualized work is growing with the constant extinction of jobs. These advances generate tensions as they improve productivity, but at the same time suppress jobs, and also they remodel labor relations with deregulation strategies, creating the conditions for deepening flexibilization and precariousness of labor, social security, union rights, as what happened now in Brazil with the approval of a labor reform in July 2007, if we can call it reform, because it's not a reform. Another central question, especially with neoliberal forces advancing, is how productivity gains of these technological advances will be distributed. Trade unions, they have been in the forefront of the struggle for democracy and social justice. However, the attacks have been so strong that trade unions tend to focus on the working place, on the national challenge, and adopt a defensive position when concrete international action should be strengthened to support also the national struggles and to build an international front against capital, international capital. Out of the discussions of the sessions, this was discussed, and therefore the role of international organizations, international trade union organizations, such as GUFs, the global unions, and ITUC, and others, they have to be strengthened. The potential of international solidarity is enormous, as seen. For example, in the case of the Brazilian coup, where clearly the international solidarity was an essential element on the resistance and on the deconstruction of what the national media, the Brazilian media, was supporting. The decline in union membership is also a common feature in most countries, which also imposes to the labor movement a necessary innovative organization of work, which has already been also mentioned by Martina and Mike, including not only formal workers, but also youth, outsourced, precarious workers, and also those that are excluded from the labor markets and that are in marginalized positions, such as immigrants and refugees. Academics and activists are using new definitions, such as neo-proletariat, precariados, to define this new type of worker. So what we need a new model, a new inclusive model to include all this working force and also combined with the community needs. The crisis of 2008, instead of affecting capital, strengthened the financial capital and forced workers to pay the bill. Resistance has been present in many different places in the world by the labor movement, but also by other movements, such as Occupy in the US, Indignados in Spain, Gezi in Turkey, and also the protests, the early protests of June 2013 in Brazil. Majority of them were youth workers, young workers, and also other sectors that not necessarily are engaged with the labor movement. Trade unions have to rethink their demonstrations, their way to protest. Who wants to listen to 20 leaders on a protest? New forms of resistance has to be taught to attract people who are going to the streets, who are willing to resist as well. People see us as part of the establishment, as was mentioned in one of the sessions. So we have to win bureaucracy, we have to win people back from the AfD, for example, in Germany. On a poll that we conducted about revitalization experiences with partners, among them Cesici, Comunicanti, and Friedrich Stiftung, trade unions organizations of different countries pointed out that economic crises are among the 10 main challenges for the labor movement. Nevertheless, there does not seem to be an understanding of the crisis due to the absence of a political, economic, and social project alternative to the hegemony of today's neoliberalism. We have some attempts like Plada in Tuca in our region. There are some, but we don't have in a global perspective. We have to broaden our alliances with social movements and progressive forces to dispute in an ideological way with workers affiliated to trade unions and non-affiliated to trade unions, to expose the devastating attacks that neoliberalism is provoking. We need to understand and talk about the power within the state, as also was mentioned today in one of the sessions. Oxfam Brazil recently informed us that 6 people in Brazil own the same as half of the Brazilian population. In other words, 6 people own the same as 100 million people, Brazilian people. On the global scale, we know it's not much different. It's around 62 people owning the same as half of the world's population. Which worker would agree with this? Who would consider this justice or fairness? Another poll organized by ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, shows that 7 out of 10 respondents believe that working people do not have enough influence on how the rules in the global economy are set. The same poll indicates that 73% are afraid of losing their jobs, and that 75% think that trade unions play an important role in society. At this stage, when nationalism is a barrier to transnational trade union action, when fascism is advancing, and xenophobia, sexism, racism, and homophobic are appearing each day more as possibilities, we have to build stronger alliances, to build bridges and dialogue with society and also with workers that do not have living and, don't have decent living and working conditions. The arguments we already have. In one of the sessions as well, it was mentioned that we need to embrace new ideas. Ecology needs it. New trade union visions and move to a social movement orientation to win bureaucracy and neoliberalism. We all here believe that GLU is an essential instrument on this struggle. on building capacity to raise what is affecting trade unions and what is affecting the working class. And also, what is blocking us to be a real development actors, as also mentioned in another session. Trade unions have collective power, as said also in one of the sessions, and we need to broaden this collective power. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for that message of broadening collective power by building movements and coalitions that are based on ideology, clear analysis, and the language I think that people can connect to. And that sort of last point, I'd like to turn to Jayati. I mean, what do you see as, what can be a language, what can be a narrative that people can turn to, and they can regain trust in the labor movement, in a better future? Because I mean, we see all over the place how much people are under threat, yet also, I mean, political reactions, voting, sometimes it's a bit contradictory, it seems. So I would like to hear from you what you see, what can we put as alternatives so that we can also win back the trust of workers.
Thank you very much, Mirko. That's a tall order, but I'm going to actually take up some of the things that were presented by the previous panelists, because I think there were elements of all of these. And it's absolutely what you say, it's the absence of a clear narrative. We need an overarching narrative. We are missing it. Let's face it, somebody brings socialism back as a narrative. We need an overarching narrative, and we don't have it at the moment. I do think it's possible. I think it's already kind of being created in different ways. And there is, I think, somebody mentioned we need to learn also from the past. And I think we have, in terms of what we can learn even from the mid-20th century, three major elements that we can use today, which I think are very critical. Because it is true that wherever we are facing very local, national, specific problems, but there is a remarkable similarity in the problems, okay? Whether it is the stagnation and fragility of workers' incomes, or it is the increasing inequality, or it is the insecurity of work, these are problems everywhere. And it is precisely those which are generating the kinds of things that Claire talked about, the fascist, semi-fascist responses, and so on. I do believe there's a narrative, and some of what I'm going to say is actually put forward in more detail in the Trade and Development Report of UNCTAD, the latest one this year, which I was also involved in helping them to write, and which I think does identify what can be done. Precisely, it talks about three things in the 20th century that were really quite relevant. The New Deal of Roosevelt, okay, which brought the US economy out of the Great Depression. The Marshall Plan, just after the war, which of course was the result of the fact that there was a threat from the Soviet bloc, but nonetheless had a lot of other consequences. And something that didn't get off the ground because it was killed by the US, but has massively interesting ideas, the Havana Charter. This was the UN Conference on Trade and Employment. I don't know how many of you have even heard of it. But the point is that this actually produced a really brilliant document, the Havana Charter, signed, as you can see, in Havana, which talks about how trade and employment can be contradictory but need not be. And what are the conditions in which you can actually get globalization and trade flows without different countries losing workers' rights and employment. Now, there are some messages of this which I think form the basis of what I would call a very critical and possible global narrative, which is achievable. And that's because everywhere we know so-called growth is slowing down, even if you don't believe in growth as the way in which to define progress. Nonetheless, we know that even that is no longer working, and global capitalism can't really work without growth, so there's a kind of problem for it. We know that nothing else is working. They have run out of ideas. They've done everything they could in terms of monetary policy and so on and so forth. None of this works anymore. So what do we say? We say we take those elements of the New Deal to create a global New Deal, which includes features of the Marshall Plan, features of the Havana Charter. Specifically, we focus on recovery, redistribution, and regulation. Okay? Recovery means what? Recovery really means a massive fiscal push. It means that one of the things about the Marshall Plan, and in fact also about the New Deal, three common features they had: speed, scale, and generosity. There was a quick response, there was a massive response. Some of you may not know, public spending in the United States triples in 1 year. Triples. Not goes up by 3% or 5%. We are very grateful if we get a 0.5% increase in public spending as a share of GDP. You're talking about a tripling. Okay? Scale and generosity. You look at the Marshall Plan, you look at how Germany was a beneficiary of the Marshall Plan. And you cannot imagine that kind of generosity today in terms of large amounts of money being transferred for very, very significant investments without repayment, or with such long repayment that it really doesn't matter, and so on. Okay, speed, scale, generosity for what? For public spending that is directed to what Hyman Minsky called the bubbling up of the economy. In other words, not trickle down, but you focus on generating employment. You create the government as the employer of last resort. You provide employment, and then you figure out what you do when you've employed them. There's always things to do in an economy. Let nobody kid you that the machines are taking all these jobs. There are lots of jobs still to do. It's that the market does not deliver it. The problem is the technological change is occurring in a context of fiscal restraint, so-called consolidation, lack of public spending, unwillingness to tax the rich, etc. Okay, so you use the public spending to do a bubbling up. You use the public spending to provide universal social protection and universal access to good quality social services. In India, we don't even know what that means because we spend so little on essential social services. I think in Northern Europe, you're much better off, but in many other parts, even in Brazil, you're much better off. But there is still huge scope for providing universal good quality social services. And you use the public spending to deal with environmental threats. Certainly global warming, but also the massive environmental challenges that we face. I mean, you've been in India for the last 2 days. You know that global warming is there, but it's there with a lot of other very, very big ecological challenges we face. Pollution, degradation, destruction of our environment, overexploitation of natural resources, lots of things that we have to deal with. Redistribution. One of the big areas of redistribution is asset redistribution. And of course, assets, it's not just financial assets, of course, but it is also the entire range of productive assets. I think Claire talked about the ratios in Brazil, but we all know in India, I think it's much worse. It's like 10 people own 60%, which is like 700 million people. So just now when we have evidence of real wages stagnating in India, Mr. Ambani has become an even richer person by 14% in 1 year. And so on. So definitely a huge amount of scope for redistribution. And that redistribution has to include all assets, including cyber assets, which are becoming some of the most important assets in the world today. 21st century wealth is also about controlling data, controlling knowledge. So a whole range of things about that. Regulation. The New Deal was all about regulation. It was about controlling capital, about controlling investment, about ensuring regulated labor markets, about providing formalized contracts for workers with minimum wage rates and all of that kind of thing. When the Marshall Plan was imposed, European countries were encouraged to do the same. So regulation is a very, very critical part of that. There are all kinds of areas of economic activity that have to be regulated, but certainly you cannot do a lot of the things you want to do if you don't regulate finance, absolutely, to start with, at the very first. But certainly you have to regulate the companies that are controlling big data and therefore now controlling many more aspects of our lives without our realizing it. You have to regulate companies involved in global value chains, as we've already talked about, Monica. You have to regulate the ways in which workers can be prevented from organizing, which is happening in India all the time as we speak. There's a huge amount of possible regulation. Now, probably people will turn around and say, oh my God, this is completely utopian. Can't possibly do it. And I think we have to remember, hey, wait a minute, it was already done before. All this happened. And it happened in a very unlikely climate. If you think of when Roosevelt came to power in the United States, and even he was an unlikely candidate, right? A rich son of a kind of, right-wing Democrat kind of tendency, very unexpected to come out with the kinds of policies that came out. It was a shift in political, social pressure, and it was the combined mobilization of many, many different groups. And I think that's where it's important. The trade unions have to stop thinking that they're just trade unions. They have to see themselves as part of much broader progressive forces in society, recognize all workers to be their constituents, which includes unpaid workers and unrecognized workers. I'm delighted to see that ITUC and Sharon and all have started looking at that, at the issues of unpaid work and domestic work. But basically it can be done. It was already done. The Havana Charter was in fact signed. It's just that the US then basically, killed it because it was against US geopolitical interests, but it can be done. And I do believe that it's not really a question of, it's true the world is terrible, and for many of us it's getting worse, almost on an hourly basis. Certainly in this university it's getting worse on an hourly basis. But I can tell you that change often happens when you least expect it. It comes from directions that you don't expect, and it's typically led by much younger people. So I'm delighted that there are lots of young people in the audience. It means you don't have to listen so much to all of us who are not as young, and you can go out there and do it. Don't lose the ambition. It's been done before, and you can do it again.
Thank you, Jayati. I think this is what we wanted to hear. We close the session now. Yeah, Praveen is shaking his head, yes. No, but that goes against the culture, I think, of the GLU. And as you said, it should be the young people out there that should have the last word. So we have about 15 minutes for you to react, for you to comment, for you to share with us what you take home from here and what you're going to do to increase the power of the labor movement. I had a suspicion that Marcelo's hand would go up. Yeah, I'm not mistaken. And then I go to Jeremy.
I would like to address the nice table on the. It was really good to listen to you. But I would like to comment on this statement. There's an important challenge to identify, recognize, and investigate different social contexts on the ground, where popular power can overcome market power. We must proceed deep further investigation in workers, community, local global victories, micro-macro revolutions. We must struggle to build local global, broad, anti-capitalist alliances, where open, umbrella, inclusive workers' community unions have a strong role to play. We radicals, progressists, socialists, commemorating 100 years of Soviet revolution, want to contribute in the alliance for the end of capitalism, for the building of a new world where a human being does not oppress another human being.
To your right, to Jeremy.
Thank you, Mirko. It's great to be at my first GLU conference, and I've really enjoyed it. But I also want to be a little bit provocative, because I think we as a group can do a lot more. This, to my mind, is a very unique gathering in the global labour movement, bringing together academics, labour activists, trade unionists, allied organisations that you just don't get anywhere else. There are lots of conferences all around the world kind of documenting the world of work and how much worse it's getting, and making these kind of careful analyses and trying to really sift the detail. But what's unique about this group is that it's kind of bringing together the activists and the academics in the same space. And I wonder if we can make more of that. So I was just thinking, listening to some of the great kind of suggestions coming from the panel at the end, I think everything that Professor Jayati Ghosh would totally agree with. What about if we kind of started with these in each stream at the beginning, some provocative policy proposals or political demands, that we could kind of sift together as a group. Because the other thing about this group, I'm not aware of anything that has such a kind of amazing geographical balance. Yeah, with the kind of the 5 centres that really do kind of reflect the diversity. Most, if I go to academic conferences, it's all very dominated by US and Europe. But this has a much richer mix. So I really enjoyed it the first time, but this was my first conference. But my suggestion is, how do we kind of turn this into a real kind of idea factory for the global led movement?
Thank you, Jeremy, for that suggestions. I do not see any hands up, and I'm not going to immediately react to that. I'm not in a position, but it so happens we have a steering committee meeting tomorrow, so that may be one of the points on the agenda. Yes, there are no more hands going up. I do not know if anybody on the panel would like to say anything in conclusion. If that is... No, you did that already, yeah? There is no point in me to repeating that. No, I think I want to thank that panel. Some of you who sort of spontaneously were being brought in that position to give a bit of a reflection on the different conference streams, bring in some of your own work and researches. And you know, what we are trying to achieve is really for you to leave that conference you know, with new ideas, with a new enthusiasm, new projects maybe in your heads that can materialize to take us forward, and maybe you can already report about some of the things that you have done at our next GLU conference. With that, I'm calling for a tea break, and according to the schedule, we should meet again here at 4:15 for a closing and feedback session. So thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues on the panel, and thank you, audience.
Day after this.